So in the case of, say, Mendocino, you would either have to go to what we call the stated value method, which is what we'll talk about, I don't think today, but we'll talk about it in the next lecture. But that basically just involves asking people directly how much do they value it at. And, or alternatively, I guess in in the case of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, you could argue that there might be some sort of revealed preferences. If you were, so like the drilling example, you could argue that if the government were basically auctioning off the rights to drilling, and people were all taxpayers and they sort of understood the relationship between the amount of money that the government could raise the auction if we allow drilling everywhere in the wildlife refuge, and how that would ultimately affect their tax burden, because obviously the government's raising a lot of money in the auction and they don't have to get as much from income taxes. And so you kind of go through that calculation and then say, well, basically by preventing drilling, then they are foregoing a tax break of this amount, and that would sort of be a way to use the revealed preferences method to elicit evaluation. But I think it would be a little bit hard to make the case that the average voter was sophisticated enough to sort of know how much oil was there and how much the government could possibly raise in an auction, and then how that would in turn affect the government budget and so forth. So you could make that argument in that particular case, but I think it would be kind of difficult to believe for most people. Okay, so with hedonic pricing, we're basically thinking of observing a transaction of a good that has a bunch of different characteristics. And so let's take the case of housing here. So if somebody goes and decides to buy a house, there's sort of a lot of different things about the house that they're assigning a value to, right? So certainly the size of the house is going to be one important determinant. So you look at the number of bedrooms it has, the number of bathrooms it has, the total square footage. You'll also be interested probably in the view, are you sort of across the street from some ugly abandoned warehouse, or do you have some nice view of San Francisco Bay or something like that? People are going to place a lot of value on that. Air quality will probably matter to a lot of people. You don't want to be in some smelly polluted place. School district quality matters a ton to people who have kids. How good are the schools that your kids are going to get sent to? And the crime rate, people aren't going to want to live in high crime areas and so forth. So there are lots and lots of different attributes or characteristics to each house that a consumer kind of goes through in their mind and assigns some value to. They're not sort of in most cases, not explicitly saying, well, I'm going to pay X dollars per square foot, and then I'm going to adjust by paying 10% less in a high crime area, and I'm going to pay 20% more in a school district and so forth. But sort of implicitly, when they're doing these calculations, when they're coming up with a value, they're presumably assigning some sort of positive and negative values to all of these different characteristics. So if different houses have different sets of characteristics, then we might be able to estimate the effect of each characteristic on the market price of the house. So for example, you might think of comparing houses that are in low pollution neighborhoods to houses that are in high pollution neighborhoods while controlling for the other characteristics of these houses. So if it turned out that the characteristics of both sets of houses were exactly identical, then you wouldn't need to control for anything, right? If it turned out that, so let's say Richmond is a high pollution neighborhood because right next to the refineries, and we'll say the Berkeley Hills are a low pollution neighborhood. If it turned out that houses in Richmond were exactly identical to houses in Berkeley along all dimensions except for pollution, then you'd be able to just do a direct comparison of how much people are willing to pay for houses in Richmond versus how much they're willing to pay in Berkeley, because the only thing that's different between those two types of houses is are the pollution levels. But in practice, of course, the houses that are on the Berkeley Hills also have better views, and they're in a lower crime neighborhood, and the school district is probably better, and so forth. So there are actually lots of different things that are different about these two sets of houses, not just the pollution levels. So in fact, what you have to do is try to control for the other things that are different about the houses. But just to sort of drive home the point of how you can infer that there's a large value that's assigned to some of these non-market goods, let's consider a case with real-world data. So the example I'm going to use here is going to compare two houses that are literally one block apart from each other, but they're in different public school districts. So the comparison is going to be basically a house that's in Piedmont versus a house that's in Oakland. So for those of you who don't know, so this is north. This is going to be my terrible not-to-scale map. But here's Berkeley, where we are. And then, of course, as you go south, you'll eventually hit Oakland, which extends all the way much further south as well. And then in Oakland, so it's pretty unusual, but Oakland actually totally surrounds another city, which is called Piedmont. And so even though it's entirely contained within Oakland, it's for legal purposes its own separate city. There aren't that many people here. I don't know exactly, probably somewhere in the tens of thousands. And Oakland contains 400,000. So certainly once we reach the post-apocalyptic world, I'm sure that Oakland will easily overwhelm Piedmont, since it's entirely surrounded. It does not have sufficient numerical manpower to defend itself. But for the moment, Piedmont is its own sort of little separate entity. And the nice thing from the perspective of Piedmont residents is that pretty much everybody who lives in Piedmont is very wealthy, at least relative to the average person living in Oakland. And so they have their own police force, and they have their own school district, which is the most important thing. And so the average test scores at Piedmont schools are much higher than the average test scores at Oakland schools. And what you get is a scenario where you can have two houses. So one house is right. House one. So one house is right here on one side of the border, on the Piedmont side, and the kids in house one are going to go to a school in Piedmont. And then the other house is right here on the same border, but on the other side in Oakland, and they're going to go to an Oakland school. So the test scores at the school where the Piedmont kids are going to be going are much higher than the test scores at the school where the Oakland kids are going to be going. And so this manifests itself directly in prices. So the Piedmont house, I pulled this a transaction from Redfin or one of those other sites. Basically, it was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, 1,235 square feet, so not particularly large. It sold for $740,000 in 2010, which works out to $600 per square foot approximately. You can see a picture of the house. It looks okay, but it's pretty small. There isn't much of a yard. Doesn't have a ton of curb appeal, I think. In comparison, the Oakland house that's just a block away is much larger. So it's 3 beds, 3 baths, almost 2,200 square feet. Sold for $708,000 in 2010. So you can see the price per square foot is almost 50% lower than the Piedmont house, and it sort of looks much more impressive. I think has a much bigger yard. And so these houses so they're not identical in every way, but it's basically, to the extent they're not identical, all of the differences go in favor of the Oakland house having a higher price, right? So it's bigger, it looks better, it has more bathrooms and bedrooms and so forth. So if they had identical school districts, you would think that the Oakland house would be much more expensive than the Piedmont house, but in fact they're basically exactly the same price. And on a per square foot basis, the Oakland house is almost 50% cheaper than the Piedmont house. So what that's demonstrating is that the price difference between the two houses reflects the value that buyers are really assigning to Piedmont schools here. So the Piedmont house costs almost twice as much per square foot, and the Oakland house looks better on almost every other characteristic other than other than the school district. So perhaps most importantly, they're actually basically in almost the exact same neighborhood. So you can't even think that like there's differences in sort of pollution levels. I mean, I guess there might be like maybe like crime rate differences in terms of like burglaries if people are just very unwilling to cross into the Piedmont, cross the Piedmont border, just because like the Piedmont police are probably less undermanned than the Oakland police. But it's hard to believe that that's kind of that the gradient falls off so quickly. So really, it seems like the distinguishing difference between these two houses is the side of the school district boundary that they lie on. And the conclusion that I would certainly draw from even just as one example is that so lots of good public schools, which aren't something that's traded on the open market, so you can't. There is, so our schooling itself is traded on the open market. You can go to a private school, but very few people do. As sort of at least as a percentage of the overall population. So if you're thinking of sort of well, what's the value of a slot at a good public school versus maybe a not so good public school, you would conclude here that they certainly appear to be worth a lot to the marginal home buyer. People are willing to pay a lot in order to get their children assigned to the better public school. Okay, so the last thing that I want to say with respect to revealed preferences and hedonic pricing is that you can also think about being more formal about it and expressing it mathematically. So you could basically write the price of a good, so let's say that the price of a house in this case, as being a function of several variables. So let's say that the price for a specific house is a function of x, which are the house's characteristics, it's a function of z, which are the neighborhood characteristics, and then it's a function of e, which let's say are the environment characteristics. So if you wanted to measure the marginal willingness to pay, basically the marginal valuation for the environmental good in this case, so the environmental good could be something like how clean is the air, or it could be something like how much noise pollution is there, how noisy is the neighborhood, something like that. But if you wanted to measure the marginal willingness to pay for the environmental good, basically what you want to do in this case is take the derivative of p, the price of the house, with respect to changes in that environmental good, so dp de. Now, sort of one wrinkle here is that the function f of x, z, and e may be nonlinear. So if that's the case, then the derivative of price with respect to the environmental good could potentially be a function of x. So in practice, what that might imply is that, for example, houses with large numbers of bedrooms might have a higher dTDE since the larger families benefit more from the clean environment. So just to be clear here, we can think about writing, so we have p is equal to f of x, z, and e. And in some cases, you might think that you could represent that with a linear function. So it could be something like it's equal to x beta plus z gamma plus e times delta. And if that were the case, if you could write it as a linear function, then when you take the derivative of d with respect to e to measure people's marginal willingness to pay for the environmental good would just be equal to delta. And importantly, you can see that this derivative would not depend on any of these other values. So it wouldn't depend on the house's characteristics or the other neighborhood characteristics. It would basically just be saying people are willing to pay delta dollars to live in a cleaner neighborhood. But in practice, probably what would be the case is that you'd have something that's more like the log of p is equal to x beta plus e times gamma plus e times delta. And so if that were the case, then it would essentially say that the proportional so essentially what it would say is that changes in the environmental good will have proportional changes on the willingness to pay, or people's willingness to pay for a given house. So for example, if you're looking at a small, so you might get like a coefficient that's say like delta is equal to 0.10. And what that would imply is that for any given house, people are willing to pay 10% more if it's in a cleaner neighborhood than if it's in a dirty neighborhood. So for example, if you had a very large house that was say $500,000, then people might be willing to pay $50,000 more if that were in a cleaner neighborhood. But if you had just a small like studio apartment or something that were $100,000, then maybe people were willing to pay $10,000 more if they were in a cleaner neighborhood. And often the reason, like in the housing case, one of the reasons why that might be is simply that you're essentially putting more people in the larger house, right? So if you think about a large house moving that from like a dirty neighborhood to a clean neighborhood, then you might have 5 or 6 people in the house who are all benefiting from the cleaner air, whereas if it's just like a small studio apartment, then you might just have one person who's benefiting from the cleaner air. So if that's the case, then the actual dollar value of the amenity here, the willingness to pay, is going to turn out to be a function of say x and z in this particular case. So the willingness to pay could increase as x, which say is the number of bedrooms or something like that, in the house increases. Alternatively, it might also be the case that if so if e is like a continuous variable that can take on lots of different values instead of just being kind of this binary like clean or dirty type of scenario, then you might think that dp de might eventually be decreasing. So that it's not that people would be willing to pay less as it got cleaner, it's just that the amount extra that they'd be willing to pay would decrease as you got cleaner and cleaner. So that'd be the case if environmental improvements didn't matter as much once you got past a certain point. So maybe at some point you get to the point where for almost all intensive purposes the pollutant is not detectable in the air anymore, and you could get it even cleaner than that, but people wouldn't value the improvements past that point. So there would be a very small willingness to pay in that case. So the point here is just that if it's not just if the function here is not just a simple linear function, then the willingness to pay isn't just a single value. It's going to depend sort of on the other values of the other characteristics of the house or the good that you're looking at, and it could also depend on sort of the level of the environmental amenity itself. Okay, the same methodology can also be applied to occupational sources. So I said at the beginning, there's sort of two cases in which you see it used pretty often. One is housing, and then the other is employment characteristics or jobs. So you can take as an example driving a truck in Afghanistan versus driving a truck in the United States. If you go and are a contract driver for one of these firms that basically contracts with the U.S. government and the U.S. military, and you go drive a supply truck in Afghanistan, you could easily make 6 figures, whereas a truck driver in the United States might make only $40,000. So you could make several times as much driving overseas as you could driving in the U.S. And there's obviously a difference between those two jobs, so there's greatly increased risk when you're driving around in a war zone to deliver supplies than relative to when you're just driving in the U.S. Furthermore, there's also the inconvenience of having to be like halfway across the world when presumably most of your family, friends, and so forth live back in the U.S. But regardless, we might use the variation in risk to estimate the driver's willingness to accept to face increased risk. So you can think of they're basically performing the same job in either case. The sort of qualifications are pretty similar. But in one case, they're performing that job in a very high risk environment, and in the other case, they're performing the job in a very low risk environment. So typically, we don't think of sort of trading people's like risk of death on an open market. But in this case, you could sort of, it's a little bit morbid, but you can sort of view that as essentially what's going on here. So maybe they'll pay you $150,000 to go drive the truck in Afghanistan, and you're going to do your own calculation to see how much extra risk you're going to take if you go and do that, and then decide whether the extra $110,000 is worth it to you versus just the $40,000 that you would make driving the truck in the U.S. in a low risk environment. And so we're going to talk about that again in the context of the value of statistical life. Then the last thing that we'll talk about here is contingent valuation. So what I'm going to do is, I'll finish up just on like this slide talking about contingent valuation. I'm going to actually post a survey for you guys, which I'll send out an email on BSpace. And it'll only take you 5 minutes to fill it out, but just fill it out and then bring it back in the next lecture on Wednesday, and then we'll tabulate out the results and discuss them a little bit later. But the survey that you'll do is basically an example of the stated preferences or contingent valuation methodology. And what it involves is basically asking people how much they pay for a good. So conceptually, it's sort of similar to this revealed preferences methodology, except that now we're just going to ask you directly how much you're willing to pay, or how much you're willing to pay, or how much you're willing to accept for either gaining or losing an environmental good. The advantage here is that you, the researcher, can construct any hypothetical scenario that you like. So if you want to know, like, well, how much do people like value having zebras in Africa or something like that, which is not something you would normally be able to measure, you could say, okay, well, I'm going to just go and ask people how much do you value having zebras in Africa? How much are you willing to pay to keep them from going extinct? We'll go over the examples later, but I'll give you guys a survey that's sort of a direct example for homework.